welcome to the show where we share the stories of the many who intersect with our healthcare system but are rarely heard from. My name is Kevin Poe, founder and editor of Kevin MD. Today in the show, we have Wes Campbell. He is a health outcomes researcher, and he wrote the Kevin MD article, Aduhelm and How Money and Politics Supersede Science. Wes, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be here.
We'll get into your article in a little bit, but first off, can you share your story and journey to where you are today?
I am a health outcomes researcher. I came to that kind of late in life. I spent the better part of a quarter century in executive leadership positions, primarily in academic medicine, mostly on the physician group side. I had a master's in health administration from the Medical College of Virginia, and I might have been the first student in that program to do an administrative residency in a physician group. So it's always been an area of focus for me. My dad's a physician, which is a big part of the reason why I'm not, although my younger brother did become a physician, and my younger sister is actually a registered nurse. So healthcare is kind of the family business in a lot of ways, and I wanted to be involved in healthcare and contribute. And as I have learned more and had other, leadership positions throughout the years, have become more and more sort of concerned with why do we get the results that we get, which is why I went and got training in being a healthcare outcomes researcher.
Now, from your perspective and experience in healthcare leadership and with physicians in your family, what would you say are some of the biggest issues that face the physician workforce today?
Well, I think the number one issue in the physician workforce, and this is a pre-existing condition pre-pandemic, is this condition of burnout, which is it's a big term. It captures a lot of different states of being, but primarily, I think I would describe it this way. The practice of medicine is not getting easier. It's getting more complex, more complicated. And as we layer on things like electronic health records and work flows downhill to the clinicians, to the physicians, because systems simply can't or won't invest in the resources they need, it gets harder and harder to practice medicine. And I saw this in my family, right? The hours that people work, how hard it was to stay current with what was going on. My dad would be at home in the evenings when he was home. And maybe he had the TV on watching the news, but he had a journal in his lap and he was reading. Well, if that time is being supplanted by people, spending 2 or 3 hours a night doing the notes from the patients they saw that day, how in the world are they staying current? Like where does that time come from? It's a finite quantity. And so now we move into this era with COVID and, issues of clinician well-being, mental health, support resources, people experiencing PTSD, grief, compassion fatigue, even in the workforce today. I think that, the overwhelming issue is kind of the state of well-being in the clinician workforce in this country and what's going to happen over the next 5 years as we hopefully emerge from the pandemic in terms of our ability to provide cost-effective, high-quality care.
Now, I talk about physician burnout on my site a lot. And of course, among the physician class, we know that burnout is a problem that certainly needs to be addressed. But I'm interested in hearing about you and your peers in terms of administrative leadership, executive leadership. Do your peers share the same views on burnout as you do?
That's a great question. I think it is a concern for sure. But I think many organizations don't exactly know how to deal with it. It strikes me that, we talk about physicians as a homogenous blob, like they are this constituency that exists. But, like the examples of what does a neurosurgeon need support-wise versus what does a family physician need support-wise, it can be very different, right? I think a lot of from the research that I have done, one of the major contributors to the burnout condition, there are, patients and the things that they bring to the table and just sort of the interpersonal part of it that can sometimes be very difficult for physicians. But a lot of it comes down to the clerical work,
Mhm.
the administrative work that's associated to this electronic environment that we live in. And I think the research is pretty clear that the amount of time many physicians spend, the so-called pajama time, in their electronic health records is not a value-added exercise. They're not reviewing results. They're not planning for the next day. They're not coordinating patient care. They're documenting care. And I think there's a perception that many have, and I think there's some truth to it, that this informatics platform that was supposed to be so powerful in helping physicians take better care of their patients is really just an exercise in capturing more revenue. And there are huge mismatches between the way organizations have approached creating incentive for physicians in terms of their compensation even, and what physicians really want out of their practice. And so I think there's an understanding of organizational leaders that this is an issue, but I don't know that they have a great grasp on the tools that they have at hand, even team-based care models, for instance, to try and address the problem. And there are limited resources, right? So they require investment,
Mhm.
and that's not always the easiest case to make.
So, what do you see as the path forward? Because I completely agree with you. In order to successfully address clinician burnout, it does require some investment, or it does require some sacrifice in revenue, for instance, if physicians were to see fewer patients, for instance.
Yeah.
What do you see as the path forward?
Well, for me, I'm hopeful that the path forward probably lies through value-based care, right? The incentives need to change. There's a misalignment of those incentives now. So many clinicians that I know, so many physicians that I know, simply see themselves kind of as salespeople working on commission. They get paid based on work RVUs, how many they're going to produce in the future. And I think that production environment, that production mentality, creates this well of burnout that physicians live in. My hope is that as organizations, and there's a big gap in organizational understanding in terms of how to move from this fee-for-service environment to a value-based environment. But if we begin to value the quality of the physician-patient interaction, the outcomes that we generate, the avoidance of cost, and organizations can understand how to calculate an ROI on a cost that doesn't exist, that maybe there'll be some change in the approach to the support mechanisms that we put around clinicians so that they can do their best work, right? Physicians have a very unique role
Mm.
in our delivery system in our society. There are things physicians can do nobody else can do. We have advanced practice providers, we have nurse practitioners, and we have physician assistants. But at the end of the day, the physicians are the cornerstone of the delivery. And if they aren't incented correctly or appropriately, we wind up with kind of this perverse environment we live in, where it's not about how good was the care you were able to provide, it was how many patients you were able to see. And I think it all kind of flows from that broken approach to how we align and engage physicians. And if we can't bring those pieces together, then I'm not sure how organizations are going to be able to step in. And physicians should be an asset in the organization. Organizations invest in assets,
Mhm.
right? They don't invest in their human assets, their physicians and other clinicians, in the same way. And my hope is that a transition to more value-based models, where we value the outcomes and there's financial risk involved, would be some medicine to salve that broken system.
All right, let's transition now into the Kevin MD article that you wrote.
Yeah.
It's titled Aduhelm. And for those who don't know, Aduhelm is Biogen's novel medication for Alzheimer's that was controversially approved earlier this year, and how money and politics supersede science. Now, for those who didn't get a chance to read your article, can you just walk my audience through it and share the story of why you decided to write it?
Yeah, so it was an interesting story, and I think the let me start with the why I decided to write it. So in the context of what was going on in the community, in the political sphere around this debate about science, particularly related to the SARS-CoV-2 virus and the COVID pandemic. People were actively avoiding vaccines. People were saying, I'm not going to get vaccinated until the FDA approves this vaccine. Public health officials are barking at the tops of their lungs. We need to socially distance. We need to wear masks. We need to get the population vaccinated. And there's like this great skepticism of science. It wasn't just about that issue. We could talk about climate change. We could talk about any number of issues, but there's this skepticism about science. Okay. So, my dad's a neurologist. I'm interested in neurosciences. I'm not a neurosciences researcher, but I've always been interested in it, and I came by that honestly. I know from an economics perspective that Alzheimer's disease and other dementias consume a huge amount of spending in the Medicare and Medicaid programs, right? 20%, with projections that it's going to be a third or more by the year 2050. There are 10,000 baby boomers every day aging into Medicare, and these dementias occur in the elderly population primarily. So here's this monoclonal antibody treatment that's developed. And if you dig into it a little bit, the clinical trials for the treatment and this surrogate endpoint of a reduction in the beta amyloid plaques, it doesn't really prove out in the clinical trials. And in fact, the risk of having a stroke associated to taking Aduhelm was greater than the cognitive benefit shown in the moderately impacted individuals in the clinical trial. So the science to that seemed pretty clear to me, right? I'm not an Alzheimer's researcher. I'm looking at this from the outside, not involved in the clinical trial. And then the price per treatment is over $50,000 a year. Well, if you do some simple math, right? I mean, you're talking about spending as much on this drug as the entire Medicare program spends a year right now. So the numbers don't work, not to mention the fact that the trust fund is going to become insolvent. So, as I was thinking about this, I kind of started to get a little bit angry about it. People were worried a year ago in the run up to Project Warp Speed that politics was going to result in the FDA being pressured to approve a vaccine without proven safety or efficacy. And as I thought about this, and this is not the first drug that has gone through this accelerated approval process. I mean, in the neurosciences space, it was a drug for Duchenne's muscular dystrophy and ALS, controversial, but the dollars were a lot smaller. The lives impacted were a lot less. I started to kind of get, a little angry about it. That, on the one hand, we were imploring people to listen to the science. And on the other hand, we were making policy decisions that seemed not to be about the science, that were about power, were about money, were about politics. And it concerned me in this particular approval with, there are more than 5 million people with Alzheimer's today. That number is going to increase dramatically over time. It consumes vast resources. It affects lives in a very profound way. That the timing of that decision in the context of what was happening in the public was pretty bad, and it kind of made me angry, frankly, and I felt like I needed to call some attention to that.
Now, to be clear, what do you think exactly were the financial and political influences that perhaps influenced that FDA approval of Aduhelm?
Well, it's a great question, and I have to say I don't know for sure, but I will say that in the political sphere. So first of all, we don't have a permanent director of the FDA. We have an acting director, and not to impugn that person's credibility by any stretch of the imagination, but the Committee on Neurosciences Therapeutics, the advisory committee, unanimously voted against approval. And that recommendation was not followed. So, where is that pressure coming from? Well, I mean, Biogen is a large company. they make a tremendous amount of money, and their stock soared after the news of the approval decision. Certainly, they're spending money lobbying. I don't know, lobbying in Congress, lobbying other individuals who may be influential with the approval process. I don't know any of the details of that. I don't want to presume any ill will on anyone's part, but I think the existence of the dollars at stake, the existence of the sort of politicization of the FDA as an entity in general, it's not new. It's been happening over years and years. This is not the first controversial approval on the part of the FDA, but it all sort of landed with a like a boom on this for me with this particular drug and this particular approval process.
Alzheimer's obviously is one of those diseases where we don't have a lot of great treatments. What's the role of patient advocate groups when it comes to these borderline experimental treatments for diseases where simply we just don't have a lot of good options?
Yeah, that's a great question, and you're getting at one of the things that motivated me to write this article, and it relates to the issue that we were talking about. How difficult it is to practice medicine and how organizations are not necessarily supporting that. I put myself in my dad's shoes, right? I'm a neurologist. I'm a memory disorder expert. I have a family sitting in front of me with someone suffering from Alzheimer's disease, a terrible disease. All dementias are horrible diseases, wanting some hope, some treatment. And I need to tell them that, yes, this drug is approved, but I can't prescribe it because I don't believe it's going to offer benefit, and the risk of harm exceeds any benefit I might believe it would offer. I think patient advocate groups can play an important role in helping to educate those that are concerned about this particular issue, whether it's the Alzheimer's Association or other patient advocate groups, about what the implications of this particular drug really are. And I think they can maybe interface with companies like Biogen and other big pharma companies with some hope of helping to set the research agenda, right? I mean, this is an example. I'm not an expert in this by any stretch of the imagination, but this beta amyloid hypothesis is just that. It is not proven. And there are dissenting opinions as to, and again, in my very simplistic view, whether the beta amyloid plaques are the result of or the cause of Alzheimer's disease. And I think, through public advocacy, through congressional lobbying efforts, through working with pharmaceutical companies, through engagement with the professional organizations for physicians groups, the American Academy of Neurology, perhaps in this case, the patient advocacy groups can provide an important conduit of information between these groups that maybe really aren't talking to each other.
I read within the last few days that the sales of Aduhelm actually are very low, and Biogen is considering cost-cutting measures because those sales are significantly below their projections.
Yes.
In that context, what do you think is the path forward for Aduhelm?
Oh, wow, that's a really good question, and I'm not sure I have a great answer for it. I think the path is to the sidelines, frankly. I think the reason why you're seeing the sales as low as they are is and it's primarily neurologists that would be writing this particular drug. They're not going to do it, right? Because of all of the issues that we've talked about. It goes back to the issues about burnout and what is it that physicians really want out of their roles, right? What do they really see themselves doing? I have yet to meet a physician in my career that wanted to provide poor patient care, right? And I know that sounds a little bit ridiculous, but I think we need to take a step back and like contemplate that for a minute. Physicians want to provide good care to their patients. They want to provide safe, effective treatments that are going to improve the health status of their patients. And I think by and large, neurologists looked at this and said, we're not going to do that. It's not proven. It's going to cause more harm, and it's outrageously expensive. And 40% of Americans in this country at least according to the reports, couldn't afford a $400 emergency expense, right?
Mhm.
So how are they going to afford $56,000 for Aduhelm? I think that's what we're seeing with the low prescription rates of this is that, the physicians, the delivery system saying that's not where we're going to make our investment. We're not going to put ourselves behind this particular product because it doesn't work. It doesn't accomplish the goal that we're seeking, which is to improve the health status of our patients.
We're talking to Wes Campbell. He's a health outcomes researcher, and he wrote the Kevin MD article, Aduhelm and How Money and Politics Supersede Science. Wes, from your perspective as a healthcare leader, what would you say are some of the trends that may affect physicians going forward?
That's an excellent question. So I think the number one trend I think I see right now is organizations all around the country understand they need to align and engage physicians. The success of health systems is dependent on the success of their relationships with physicians. At the same time, I don't know that many organizations understand what in the world that means, what alignment is and what engagement is. And I think they maybe they throw things at the problem without really understanding what that problem is, and then their attempts to resolve it, improve alignment, improve engagement, reduce burnout, don't work, and so they lose some enthusiasm for it, or they find themselves just sort of perseverating on this
Mhm.
spot, and they can't decide which way to move. So I think over time, and those are big catch-all terms, alignment and engagement. We could spend hours talking about what I think they mean. I think that's the number one struggle right now is if you're a health system executive, you want aligned physicians, you want engaged physicians, but you're not exactly sure how to do that. And figuring that out for your organization, I think, is the number one pathway to success in the future.
And my final question, what's your take-home message that you want to leave with the Kevin MD audience?
Oh, thank you for that question. So my take-home message would be for clinicians, particularly for physicians, right? And it's about these issues of alignment and engagement. Your voice should be powerful, but you have to use it. And it's very difficult, particularly for non-clinicians, no matter how empathetic they may be. And I think you deserve to have empathetic colleagues and leaders who make efforts to make your job easier. You need to speak together with that voice, but nuanced enough so that we understand it's not a one size fits all solution, right? The differences in the needs between the neurosurgeon and the family physician befuddle organizations. It can't be a one size fits all approach. And so use your voice, speak up, draw the line. Organizations have to have physicians, right? Who admits patients to the hospitals,
Mhm.
right? So I think that would be my take home message is I think you can demand from your leadership a higher degree of empathy, and you can provide your leadership with more cohesion in your voice around what specifically it is that you need to do your job better. And then you can watch very closely because the difference between words and deeds starts to show up here. And if we're talking about resolving these issues, but organizations aren't putting their money behind resolving these issues, then you have a very good indication about their authenticity.
Wes, thank you so much for sharing your
My
time and
pleasure.
insight. And thanks again for being on the show.
Thanks. I appreciate that.